Hi there, you're very welcome to this Havel channel interview with Siim Kunpas. Siim, who is from Estonia, is head of the Policy, Strategy and Partnerships team within the Information Integrity and Countering FIMI division at the European External Action Service, the European Union's diplomatic service. Siim, that is one long description. What does your job actually entail?
Hi, and you're correct in that the EU has a special knack in coming up with these really terribly long ways to, at times, convey a very simple message. And in our case, that message really is that we are trying to, for the past 10 years almost, we've tried to figure out, first better understand and then figure out what to do about countries such as Russia and China using information against us as the EU, but also against our good partners in the EU's neighborhoods and further away as a literal weapon to undermine natural democratic processes in those countries. So this is what we're all about.
Well, as I said, you're involved in countering FIMI, which means foreign information manipulation and interference. You prefer this term to disinformation or misinformation?
We do, and there's a reason, and then this is not another case of the EU just coming up with another a bit too long name to describe an old problem. This is really a sort of a paradigm shift, if you will, in the sense that disinformation and misinformation, this is all about content, a piece of content that we can deem problematic because it's incorrect or misleading. In the case of misinformation, unwittingly so. In the case of disinformation, knowingly so. And we did start with that concept in our work back in 2015 when the first part of the what has now grown into a full-fledged operation grown. We worked with the idea of disinformation for years and analyzed content and narratives and wanted to better understand what Russia's high-ranking spokespeople were saying and so on. And we do that to this day. But at one point we realized that this is really not enough. I often compare this to the analogy of a bullet. So disinformation could be seen as a bullet that hits somebody and at worst case causes some harm, some tangible harm. But in addition to that bullet, we also have a gun, we have a shooter, we have a whole ecosystem, if you will, around it. And same really applies to disinformation. Before a piece of disinformation reaches any eyeballs, somebody has to plan for it, somebody has to generate it, either write something, use AI-powered tools to generate deepfakes. There are so many different ways to generate this information. Then it has to go up somewhere on a platform, on a website, or in a radio station, because it's not just online, there's also offline activity as well. And then somebody needs to amplify it. So with that switch from disinformation to FIMI, we are really trying to better capture the problem as such, and we do believe that this approach has three kind of fundamental benefits. First, it's more wholesome, meaning it captures the kind of manipulative process better. Secondly, we believe it is more scientific in that analyzing narratives is very tricky because there is no one single agreed, universally shared way of analyzing narratives. And also it's all very subjective and descriptive. If you read a report on an event where, let's say, Russia tried to use a disinformation operation against whoever, you need to go through tens, if not hundreds of pages of reports written by think tankers, written by researchers, academics, governments, and even if you take that time to read through all of that material, it is very hard to compare notes and very hard to make sense of what actually happened because everybody looks at it from their own point of view. Whereas the FIMI approach that we developed first at the EAS and are now promoting is there's a very clear way to label and categorize those different manipulative, what we call tactics, techniques and procedures or activities, let's put it more simply. So there is a very clear way to do that and this means we can much more clearly label what is happening, and essentially, to dumb it down, we can speak the same language with other partners who use a similar approach, because that way of making sense and labeling those information operations is in a way universal. And lastly, I think what is really important in the context of the place we're at today, Václav Havel's library, it is much more compliant with fundamental freedoms. And what I mean by that is, often when we talk about and discuss addressing disinformation, people raise the argument of, what about freedom of speech? Everybody has the right to believe and say what they want, including lies, be it unwitting or a knowing lie. So true. But when we look at manipulative behavior, we can sort of bypass that conundrum, because it doesn't, if we can prove that somebody is conducting an information operation by, for example, setting up, let's say, 100 fake accounts on any given social media website, or a number of websites that look like The Guardian or BBC or Deutsche Welle, but actually maybe have 2 letters switched in the address, and so on. So by setting up this manipulative network, in the end, it doesn't even matter what's being pushed out by this network. If we can prove that there is a foreign government behind this type of activity on our soil, then this is a moral red line. We don't have to accept that sort of behavior, and that network can actually push out genuine information. It can maybe support some grieving voices within society, some genuine, actual existing people's voices. So there is no disinformation in sight, but there is information manipulation. And by looking more, not only, but first and foremost, at manipulative behavior, we can really, kind of in that way bypass the critique on freedom of speech. I'm sorry for a long-winded answer, but it just needs a bit of a going over with, just to lay the lands.
One thing I'm very curious about is what the European Union is telling member states that they need to do to protect themselves from this kind of information warfare.
Well, as the foreign arm of the EU, our task, our mandate, our role within the EU is somewhat limited, because our first focus is outside of our immediate borders, given the organization we are. But that said, we do excuse me, very closely cooperate with European member states, and we have set up ways to do that, a network that brings together all 27 EU member states, and specifically experts who work on this very topic in their governments. And what we're saying is, I could sum it up in a couple of things, I would say. First and foremost, we're saying that please take this seriously. This is an actual threat to us, made ever more evident ever since Russia's full-scale invasion more than 2 years ago now. Secondly, we are happily sharing our view, so that's kind of a pivot from disinformation as being the core of the problem to information manipulation, especially coming from abroad, hence the F in the FIMI, foreign information manipulation. And we're promoting that approach mainly because it is good if we can speak, not even good, it is essential that we speak the same language. So this is the next step, and from there we can already go on about sharing very specific ideas on what to do in terms of better monitoring or analyzing or responding or media literacy or trainings and so on. There's a whole toolbox that we developed to support the member states and our partners and organize our own work better.
The Russians fight dirty in every way. We, I guess, as the European Union, as Europeans, can't fight dirty because we have principles. Does that make it harder to combat this kind of manipulation?
There are different ways to answer this, but I would say absolutely, because you can, for example, compare it to a boxing match, and imagine you have somebody who is in the wrong category, weight category for you, and who is on steroids and who doesn't follow any of the rules of the game that usually are agreed, and you have somebody else in that same boxing ring that plays by those rules and doesn't use doping or unallowed substances and all of that. So it does put us in a bit of a disadvantage, but at the same time, of course, I think this is something we just have to take as the baseline of our work. In a way, I think there is room to be bolder in our responses, for sure, but there is a line we should never cross, because I do believe that if we cross a certain line in that particular fight against foreign information manipulation, then it is very hard to make a compelling case to our own citizens that we are different.
The European Parliament elections in June, before they took place, there were reports that the Russians were trying to influence the voting. They were even paying off some politicians in some countries. What's your sense of what influence the Russians ultimately did have during the elections, or is there any way to measure that?
It is one of the hardest questions in our line of work. Again, different ways to answer that. If I want to, get a bit of a get out of jail free card, I would say that in a way it doesn't even matter, because if we talk about the electoral integrity of the European Union, then this is something holy, something sacred to us, and we don't have to allow any foreign power to even try to interfere in that. It doesn't even matter what effect there was or wasn't. The mere fact that we can compellingly showcase that they are actively trying to do that, and in different parts of the EU, is, I would say, enough for us to merit responses to that.
Is there also a danger, though, of us kind of blowing the threat out of proportion and making people overly nervous about the information they're consuming and feel like it's kind of hopeless because the Russians are manipulating us like hell?
You're absolutely correct in that. Whenever I talk about this subject, I often mention that we need to strike good, optimal, what I would call threat level awareness. And optimal in the sense that if people are ignorant of the threat, they are not motivated to act. Governments are not motivated to fund setting up relevant teams. They are not motivated in really taking any steps needed, because governments play a clear role in addressing the issue, especially when we talk about state level activity. On closer to earth, individuals are not motivated to take up media literacy advice. They're not motivated to follow independent media maybe, and so on and so forth. So people need to be aware, but absolutely the pendulum can swing too far on the other end of the spectrum, and this is where a concept that some people call cognitive hacking or perception hacking comes in play, meaning there is a chance that we overplay the issue, and not just us doing that alone, but the other side is knowingly pushing us to overplay the size of the threat, and also, very importantly, the capabilities that the perpetrator has. There have been very clear cases of that where some high-ranking people in the Russian system come out tongue-in-cheek and clearly state that they basically decide who wins the next elections in country X. That is absurd. They don't have the means to do that. They are trying, for sure. There's plenty of evidence to prove that, but it really feels that at times they are almost trolling us, or kind of trying to get that exact reaction, because in the end, if people lose trust in, for example, electoral integrity, we have already lost. It doesn't matter whether the Russians, for example, manage to sway people on the voting day in the voting booth, but if we do not trust the system as such, we already lost the game.
Russia isn't Europe's only adversary in this area. The Chinese also are active when it comes to interference. Could you possibly briefly compare the approaches of those two actors when it comes to interference?
This is something that many very smart people are keeping an eye on, and we are definitely seeing some overlap, especially in messaging. When it comes to topics relevant to either Russia or China, we see the Chinese Communist Party amplifying Russian messages that it was, for example, a biolaboratory somewhere in Ukraine funded by the US where the COVID virus were originally conceived, or vice versa. But from what we've seen so far, and this is not necessarily conclusive, and this might change, is that this is rather opportunistic. When they see a good moment, they seize it and they hop on the train. We also see a bit of what some would call the Russification of Chinese information operations. So before the full-scale invasion and before the COVID crisis, Chinese information manipulation was much more soft-handed. It was much more similar to almost this old-school propaganda, where they just try to lead their own and make themselves look better and not focus that much on the negative. And this is actually something that Russia also did before, I'd say, around 2008, when they started their activities in Georgia. So that was a shift in the way they looked at it as well. So there is some overlap. They are seizing some opportunities when they arise. There are some structural agreements, for example, between Russian and Chinese state-controlled outlets. But so far, I think it's also a very asymmetric relationship, because Russia and China are not on par. It's very clear who is the greater power in this equation. So I think time will tell which way this goes.
My final question, looking to the future, are you optimistic that European states, European societies can actually defend themselves against this kind of information warfare?
Sure, I have to be. I mean, I cannot be pessimistic, otherwise I would just burn out very, very quickly. I've been working on this topic first at the Estonian Government Office and now at the European External Action Service for 6, turning 7 years soon. And honestly, to this day, I have no troubles with convincing myself why I go to the office every day, because it's a fight that needs to be fought. On the other hand, it's a never-ending fight. So we've seen how integral and central information as a weapon is to regimes such as the Russian and Chinese ones. So no matter what we do, we can throw sanctions at them, we can raise media literacy, we can train people. Russia will not stop. What we can do is we can raise our own defenses, and this is what we're doing, and not just our own, but the defenses of our good partners in the EU's neighborhood and further away. Plus, we can slow them down. We cannot make them stop, but we can slow them down and make it more costly by, exposing their operations, which means they maybe have to shut down certain outlets, set up new ones, by imposing sanctions, meaning again they have to find another route, invest that money that they don't have endless mountains of, especially when their war machinery is consuming so much of their state budget.
Siim Kumpas, thank you very much for your work. Thank you for speaking to us, and thank you for watching the Havel channel.